I'm here to talk about the fact, or the idea at least, to start a conversation about you writing a framework. I'm Wes, I write JavaScript at Atlassian. There's a Twitter handle, but not really much happens there. I guess the premise is that whether you write something that's micro or monolithic, something that's supposed to handle something very small or handle things that are really big, I think that you can make some lives easier. So first, I think it's useful to define framework for the sake of the talk. Wikipedia for a long time helpfully defined framework, the word framework, in the programming context as a buzzword. So that didn't help. But actually over the last about year and a half, there's been a really sort of healthy debate around what pieces of things make up a framework or what differentiates a framework from libraries or APIs. I'm not going to use that definition strictly, but what I do want to talk about is, sorry, just a sec. The idea of moving from a place where, as application developers, we think about our apps as our app and the whole code as our app, to thinking about how we can up-level things to be sort of a level up from our app and be sort of upstream from us. And our app doesn't change that code. Our app maybe hands stuff to that code and it handles maybe control flow or something for us, or it helps us out in some way, but it's above the app, so the app doesn't sort of modify its internals. So basically going from one big app to having something upstream from us. And I'm going to talk about how we can begin thinking about doing that, and I know that there are certainly people here who are already doing that, but I want to talk about and encourage you to, if you're not already, to start doing that, and what sort of things I think about when I'm going through that process, and how I think it helps you up-level as a developer. So yeah, there's nothing, I guess, about my definition that differentiates you from an API or from libraries, except that whatever that layer is, it's something that may encapsulate multiple things and then expose a single API to itself. Again, the Wikipedia article insinuates that there must be some inversion of control, right, where the framework handles lifecycle. I don't think that's necessary right out of the gate as you begin pulling components out of your app and putting them upstream. What I think is important is that whenever you take those components, libraries, or interfaces, you put them all inside of a container and then interface only with that container. So that's the definition I'm going with for now. So yeah, why? Why should you framework? What should you framework? How should you go about it? How do you think when you're writing framework code? And then I'll do a little, I think, advocacy around the JavaScript community specifically, because I think we're positioned in an interesting place right now. So I work for Atlassian. Atlassian writes, I think, about 8 different applications. All but 2 of them are just big Java applications. And whenever you read Java code, and one of the sort of interesting transitions that I had when I came to the company, I was at a place with a LAMP stack before that. I was very comfortable if I met a bug that could potentially be in the framework level with just walking the stack trace up to that point and, modifying it if I needed to, or understanding that abstraction better. Whereas Java developers tend to really trust their abstractions. And I think that that's in some part due to the maturity of that group, but it's also something that I think the JavaScript community is getting to a place where it could be that comfortable as well. And in a recent project, I've been writing what is essentially a single-page app, and if you go to the server, the only thing that's really there is a REST API for persistence. We're using the server to persist data. The client is doing most of the heavy lifting for business logic. And whenever you look at the REST endpoints for this application, if you go to look at one specifically, you'll get to a place where, another sec, sorry. Okay. There we go. You'll get to a place where the REST endpoint is implemented. And in the comment above that method, it's just going to be a method. And in the comment above it, there will be a part of the comment that tells you, it's an annotation, and it'll tell you exactly the route that is required for an HTTP request to invoke that method. And then the parameters to that method are going to be the get or post parameters that are sent as a part of that call, and then the return value is just a Java object. There's nothing special about it. And all the serialization, deserialization, all of the parts of an HTTP request, headers, cookies, sessions, all of that's just handled for you, and it's hidden from you, and you just trust it, and it works. And so you see things like this, and you think, man, frameworks are really useful. So you go back to your JavaScript friends, and you're like, frameworks. We're going to write a framework. And they kind of look at you like, framework? And I think that JavaScript developers so far have been really skeptical of frameworks. It's no accident that Backbone is so popular. It's popular because it's simple. It's also no accident that just huge numbers of JavaScript developers have this death grip on jQuery as the thing that they're going to use in their framework. It's because you can go and read 100% of that code. You can go and understand all of it really, really easily, and it's because they don't trust their abstractions. So why do I think we should move beyond that and begin building either bigger pieces of things and trust that code to handle a lot of the major repetition pieces for us? I'm going to go with sort of a soft argument and then a hard argument. So in Hackers and Painters, Paul Graham encourages us to think of our trade as a craft and to consider our code art and to take on that art and to consider ourselves artists, to take on the hard decisions and the trade-offs and treat them as things that have subtlety to them. Another artist, Kurt Vonnegut, was written to by a primary school classroom, and they were asking essentially how to be awesome like he is. I don't know what they asked, but they asked something. And he writes back to them, which is pretty cool. And his advice is essentially to just practice any art. Whatever your art is, to practice it. No matter how well or badly you're going to go at it, to practice it. And his main advocacy is to do it for the sake of the experience of becoming, not to put it on GitHub for the world to consume, but just to experience becoming just a little better at that thing. He goes so far as to advocate that you tear it up right after you're done with it. Like I said, I think for a lot of us that looks like putting it up on GitHub. You know, there's the bin or the whole world can view it, whatever. So that's the soft side, right? That's I think you should do this in order to practice. There's also like much more pragmatic matters, which is I think it makes you a better developer. So application developers, in my experience, and as an app developer, someone who is concerned with applications on a regular basis myself, I'm very interested in how to make my box transparent and how to fit that cat into the box and how to get that to the market and how the market is going to respond to that cat in that box. And as a framework developer, I think you have to think about how you're going to build a system that is going to make transparent or opaque boxes, depending on what the people using it need, and how it's going to fit any sized object. So it teaches us how to be intentional about the edges that we expose to the rest of the world. Applications tend to be built with concerns separated, but then as you go about writing them, you end up using the things. So each of these objects exposes a number of APIs, and they basically serve one concern, but all the other pieces need to interoperate with those concerns. And so you end up with an undirected acyclic graph of objects. And I think that in writing frameworks and learning how to think about writing a framework, you sort of up-level into thinking about how you can better encapsulate those concerns. So in an app, integration can be tight because there's only one instance of this thing in the world. And when a feature needs to be implemented, and this is where some of those extra lines come from, whenever a new feature needs to be implemented, you just add one more connection, right? You just add one more line in order to eke out that one new thing you want it to do. And you stretch the limits of your originally intended boundaries. And I think that in learning to move things upstream from ourselves, we'll learn how to go about taking those separated objects and packaging them up, and then from that package of objects, exposing one coherent API. I think that it teaches us also how to go into this process with eyes open about how what we expose will affect those that consume the framework. So I guess this is, I didn't put a lot of thought into what each of these things says, but I suppose if you were a company that was concerned with sending email well, and you always wanted your email to generate statistics so that your customers could come look at when it was sent and when it was opened and all that, you would have something that looks something like this. And if you built a framework out of this and exposed those things to the world, and then someone wanted to send an email without tracking it, maybe that would be a problem. I don't know, because you've expressed that opinion, right? The opinion being that messages, when they're sent, get statistics attached to them. But that's the eyes open part. That's where you go in knowing if I make, I can either make generating statistics really easy for everyone who uses my framework, or I can make them do a little more work, and then anyone who uses this framework can send it with or without statistics. So those are the sorts of trade-offs that I think make this into an art. So what to framework? So I'm standing on stage in front of a room full of JavaScript developers, and JavaScript frameworks, there are a few of those. They've been around for a while, and I'm not advocating that you build a new framework to build web applications. I think that's been done. In a pretty good article defending Not Invented Here syndrome, Joel Spolsky says that you should reinvent things even if they've been invented. You should reinvent them if it's something that differentiates your application from the rest of the applications in the world. If it's your defining factor, if it's what makes you in the market, you should probably reinvent it, because chances are you're very concerned with doing it better than anyone else. So if you're at an org that, because of the industry you're in, needs to send faxes, maybe you write a framework that makes all the apps that send faxes do it in the same way, right? If you're sending email, similarly, maybe you really want how you send email to be done better. And again, since I'm not using the inversion of control definition of framework, I don't want you to be too concerned with when you up-level things, when you push them upstream, about whether or not they need to handle the whole life cycle of your app. And I think that actually comes out in reality. A lot of really great frameworks have come out of individual products where the creator of that product began to slowly pull library after library out of their product and into something upstream, and then eventually that thing that they were building upstream from their app became a framework and began to take on control of the sort of operational control of how the app runs, and became sort of sovereign, full-fledged frameworks. So don't be concerned about letting things build organically and pulling more and more stuff into your upstream. So how to go about building a framework? I'm not about to go on a tutorial for how to build frameworks, but I will go through some practical steps that I find myself thinking about when sort of trying to pull things upstream from my application. So I guess consider which pieces of code are framework and which are downstream from that framework. I'm going to start with reading code. So I'm going to talk about reading other frameworks and how I think that's a good practice to learn how to think in sort of framework level terms. Then it's deciding what to pull upstream and what to push downstream. So what to push onto implementers and what to pull into a framework. And then I'll talk about how that decision has to be gone into with intention, and knowing that you're making trade-offs and knowing that you're making decisions about the complexity that either you'll take on or your consumers will take on. So you should read a lot of code. That's probably just generic advice across all programmers. If you want to become better, you read lots and lots and lots of other people's code. I would assume that though I get paid to output new features and new programs and to fix bugs, I actually spend a larger portion of time reading other people's code than I do outputting my own. And in reading framework code, you're going to what out every now and then. It's going to be a little confusing here and there because framework developers do crazy stuff in order to sort of automatically connect things that are just named similarly, right? Like they're going to concatenate that function name with this other function name and then use them as an array lookup in this hash that contains methods and invoke the function that is the concatenation of those two things that a user passed in order to connect, the route to the controller. But I guess the point being that whatting out when you are reading framework code is rarely the result of bad code. It's often an opportunity to learn something. It's often doing something pretty cool. Reading the dependency injection stuff in Angular can kind of do your head in, but it's pretty sweet when you realize what all the pieces are doing. If it's actually bad code, just remember every bad idea was someone's good idea, and it was more likely a compromise. This is just generically true across all programming, right? When you're reading someone else's garbage code, it's because they had to make trade-offs, right? They needed to get it out the door on time, or they needed to shim that thing into a system that already existed. If you're going to read framework level code for the first time, Backbone is just an amazing place to start. I wasn't trashing it earlier when I said that it's popular because it's simple. It's great because it's simple. It's also a great place to start if you're just starting out and reading framework code. If you're comfortable with the language and you're comfortable reading if you've read frameworks in other languages, you can have a really good reading of Backbone in a single sitting. An honest, I really understand everything that's going on and why these pieces exist in about probably 3 hours. If you're new to the language or you're slightly uncomfortable with it or you've never read frameworks before, it's really easy to split up into conceptual pieces and read each one a night for 4 or 5 nights. Make sure you're reading the annotated source. The authors were super intentional about how they comment their code and how they go about documenting it so that you can understand each chunk. So that's reading. Next, we'll talk about how I think, what the sort of types of things I think about when I think about pushing things upstream from my app. So this is a well-understood model. If you're writing Node, just replace the word client with server. If you're writing browser-based code, you always sort of understand that you interoperate with APIs that are upstream from you. Your application sits below sort of the client. And the goal being to take things that are repetitive or that are causing pain or that make things painful for new developers on your team and put it in between the client and the application so that if you're writing a sort of a sovereign framework, then you start to consider that your application is interfacing with this framework, and then that hides stuff from the client, right? Like the application almost never talks directly to the client for stuff anymore. It talks to the framework. If you're just building, if you go back to the examples with sending email, right? Like maybe your app no longer ever talks to the message queue. It never talks to the statistics subsystem. It always just talks to the framework that handles that stuff for you. The goal is just to find pieces that need to be up-leveled. So look for code that's being repeated at every turn, things that are repeated multiple times and are consistently hard, pieces that cause problems for new developers. If every time there's a new guy for the first month, they write bugs in X could probably be moved upstream and made easier, right? You could make doing something hard easy for people. If you're going after domain-specific problems, think about the domain-specific solutions that your company offers or that your application offers over its competitors. So if you're trying to not reinvent things that have been invented elsewhere, what are the things that set your app apart? One really convenient place I've found to start thinking about what things need to be moved upstream from the application is, sort of two pieces. It's in testing. So for one thing, you should always consider your tests downstream from your app. If your tests are sort of just a part of your app, you're probably going about it slightly wrong, and especially if you find yourself modifying application code for the sake of testing. So this is both a good way to begin thinking about the boundaries between components, but it's also a good way to find things that could be moved upstream from the app. So if there's something that needs to be mocked in every test, it should probably be upstream. And then just the framework tier needs to be mocked. If there's something that the setup function in every test does, then whatever that's doing can probably be moved upstream from your application, and then that framework can be tested, and then all the other applications within your organization don't need to do that duplication in their tests, they just need to use that framework. So that's reading code, and that's how some sort of pragmatic tips around how I think about beginning to separate how to begin moving things upstream from your application. And now is sort of the art piece of it. So when deciding what opinions to express from a framework, you're basically deciding what complexity to push downstream. So every time you separate a new component and you say this thing is only concerned with this one task, you're essentially pushing complexity into someone downstream. So the fewer opinions your framework expresses, the more complexity you're pushing to the implementer. So this is a system that has very few opinions, right? Each of these things is isolated, it has its own separate concern, but everything else that needs to have anything to do with that concern takes on the complexity of connecting all the different pieces. Whereas this is something that's quite opinionated, right? So yes, internally, these things are connected to one another, and they're coupled. They are coupled. It's just a fact. They're pieces of your framework are going to be coupled. But the interface that they push out to consumers allows those consumers to take on less complexity. So just go in with eyes open about that. And there's a whole range of these in the JavaScript world as things exist. So Backbone philosophically doesn't take on many opinions. The goal was not to make application development easy. The goal for them was to make a set of components that every web app needs. So they were trying to find the minimum viable set that are generically useful. All web apps need X, Y, and Z. Whereas on the other end of that opinion spectrum is something like Ember, where their goal was to canonify common idioms. So this is the one true way that we've decided, that framework has decided, that you need to go about doing things. And then you only focus on what differentiates your app from other apps. So they've been quite opinionated about their framework. And that all essentially comes back to, if you're writing Backbone code and your controller needs to take on multiple pieces from your model and then push things out to views, whereas Ember might automatically connect the route, model, view, and controller during its bootstrap phase. So JavaScript specifically, I think we're in an interesting position as a community. Historically, people have been interested in languages that are either server-only or client-only. So for a long time, we weren't doing a whole lot of heavy lifting in the client at all, and you had a couple of different languages, whether it was Java, Ruby, Python, PHP, and I assume Java was the first one to do it fairly well, where you would implement a model view controller on the server and then use the client as essentially a dumb paint. And that's how the web worked for just a very long time. So the server is where all the business logic is performed, data is sent to the client, and it's used to paint that data. And then it also has some concerns around user input, right? The user clicked on position 239 by 48, and that's a button. So we're going to send the information about the form or we're going to send a post that's related to that form back to the server, and then the server recalculates what it needs to draw in response to that and sends it back for another paint. Then we started doing sort of single-page apps or doing a lot of heavy lifting on the client, and we realized we could do a lot of our JavaScript had become good enough, or maybe it was good enough all along, I'm not sure, but it had become good enough that we can begin doing our business logic in the client, and we began to use the server as essentially a dumb data store. So it's there for persistence. The user has done some things, our model has changed, let's sync it. It's essentially a sync call. The business logic is essentially contained inside the client. And this is not entirely true if you were doing more complex stuff on top of that data sync, right? Like if your server was doing some hard number crunching, you could have things in the server, but by and large, for simple CRUD apps that were doing heavy lifting in the client, the data was just, or the server was just there for data access and persistence. And now we're building things in Node, and well, this is splat side MVC, but really it's splat side splat, right? Does it need to be MVC? I don't think we're all convinced, or at least I hope no one's convinced. One, because MVC is sort of a bad term, and otherwise because I don't think we've arrived. I don't think we're there yet. So I think that the JavaScript community has uniquely positioned itself because we're comfortable writing code both on the server and on the client. We have an opportunity to build complete end-to-end solutions to a problem that's consistently hard. And we have the opportunity to make that easy. And it's essentially by writing code that can run in either place. I think that Meteor and Derby are the closest approximations to this so far. I don't think neither of those projects are done by their creators' standards. So you can go get involved in them, or you can begin writing frameworks that are similar to them. So we're still driving towards solutions, and I don't think anyone thinks that we've arrived. But go take a look at one of those if you haven't already. They're essentially doing, major pieces of the lifting on both sides, depending on what you want to do. There are also some components that are doing things quite well, doing one thing quite well, and have the opportunity to evolve into the canonical way of doing something. So React's already been presented on here, but it's something that does views very well, and it's a new approach to drawing the view with the virtual DOM. I couldn't find a logo for Q, but Venable Promises are coming about as a new and they're not new, but they're an interesting way of going about doing async programming. I know the Node devs have opinions about that, but it's certainly a new and an interesting way of going about async programming. Moment is obviously of the things that do times, it's probably the one doing it the best at this point. And if a framework comes along that needs to draw to the DOM, maybe it'll take on React as the canonical way if at some point the community decides that that's a great way to do it. I'm pretty consistently using Venable Promises in all of my code just because I'm fairly sure it's better than callback passing to methods. But I guess what I want to say about that is that if we move into a space where we're solving end-to-end solutions, we'll need solutions to these individual problems that are quite good, and we may be getting close to some of those. So if you decide to write a framework that's going to be exposed to the rest of the world, go about doing the individual things well. Go consume pieces that already exist on the web and are done well. And that's it for me.